The movie Revenge serves as a sort of return of form to the Brutality Of series, as it bears a resemblance to the movie that actually started all of this, I Spit on Your Grave, and because of covering that series in its entirety, as well as this also falling into the category of New French Extremity, then it's absolutely no surprise at all to learn that Revenge has been a highly requested movie for the channel. The movie begins by giving us a shot of vast nothingness to really set the scene of what kind of environment this movie is going to take place in. Nothing but sand and rocks to be seen for miles, apart from the faint sight of a helicopter getting ever so closer to the viewer. A couple, Jennifer and Richard, land at this luxury home way out in the middle of nowhere before, well, getting to know each other. Later that night, it's confirmed that Richard actually already has a wife and a family, as later that night he takes a phone call from his partner where you can not only just hear her, but also his crying baby in the background. You know, just to let you know that he's like a really good person and all of that. The next morning, as Jennifer's getting herself a glass of water, she's startled by the sight of a man standing outside of the window holding a rifle who seems to be completely unaware or even unfazed at his incredibly creepy reliance on staring for too long. He's quickly accompanied by a second armed man, and after a brief but tense moment, it's revealed that the two are actually just acquaintances of Richard and that the men have come all the way out here for their yearly hunting trip. After they all hang out for the day, partying and drinking, the two friends, Stan and Dimitri, spot a bag of peyote given to Richard by the helicopter pilot as a welcome gift. But while Richard isn't smart enough to realize that he probably shouldn't be cheating on his wife, he is smart enough to realize that strong psychedelics and guns just don't mix, telling the group a story of a guy who took some peyote and then cut off his entire leg without feeling a thing. And as the men really insist on taking it, he has Jennifer hide it from the pair as she puts it in her locket. Jennifer feels in the mood for some dancing, and as Richard declines to join her, she chooses Stan, the guy who's got the tendency to stare at Jennifer perhaps a bit longer than he really should. And the day after partying and drinking, Jennifer wakes up to learn that Richard is off giving the passports to the local gamekeeper, while Dimitri is lounging in the pool, nursing off his hangover. With no one else around, she sits down to talk with Stan while waiting for Richard's return. And once again, Stan's back at it with his creepy over-the-top staring, clearly expecting the same type of chemistry that he believed the pair shared last night, but it just isn't there. To Jennifer, it was nothing more than just a little bit of fun dancing, but to Stan, it was more, despite Jennifer being with his friend Richard anyway. He's clearly offended by her disinterest in him as she tries to avoid conversation before awkwardly excusing herself to leave the uncomfortable situation. So Stan takes it upon himself to stand in her doorway and secretly watch her as she changes, before then being caught and awkwardly attempting and failing to ask her out. You know, like the perfect thing to do after you've just been caught perving on a woman. Stan clearly doesn't understand or care for other people's boundaries. She's made it abundantly obvious that she's not even remotely interested, yet he keeps pushing, right up until he plainly asks her what she doesn't like about him. He seems to be under some kind of deluded impression that just because the pair had danced the previous night, then that means he's entitled to her. And after being rejected once again, he begins to get increasingly aggressive, both passively and physically, before attempting to inappropriately touch her and eventually engaging in a full-on assault. And just as he's about to begin, Dimitri walks into the room, chowing down on a packet of food, with the perfect opportunity to stop this before it gets worse. And just as you're thinking, this can put a stop to it, this is Jennifer's way out, he simply leaves the room, shuts the door behind him, and goes for a casual swim, knowing full well what's occurring in that other room. Later that day, Richard eventually returns, and Stan makes no effort to hide his axe and directly tells him the truth, resulting in Richard, the guy who's clearly very concerned about his partner's feelings and always has their best interests in mind, right, attempts to bury this whole situation under the rug by trying to pay her off with a new job in Canada and a bank account full of money. He has no interest in doing the right thing here. He doesn't love her, he doesn't care about her, he just wants to silence Jennifer and to get her far away. But once she refuses and threatens to call his wife to tell her about the affair, his entire demeanor changes, as if a switch has just been flipped in his head. He hits her across the face, drawing blood, as she attempts to sprint away into the desert. All of the men only have their best interests in mind here. Richard's not doing this to cover up for his friend Stan. He's doing this because if his wife and kids were to find out about his selfish affair, then his world would crumble. Stan doesn't want to face the consequences consequences of what he did to her, and Dimitri was basically complicit with the entire thing, knowing exactly what was occurring and making no attempt to stop it or contact the authorities. The only way to make this problem go away for the men is if Jennifer goes away, whether that be to Canada or something else. And seeing as she's already threatened to expose Richard to his wife, once they have her cornered at the edge of a cliff, he pushes her off, causing her body to be savagely impaled by a tree branch below. With the two other men incredibly shocked about what Richard's just done, he tells them that he did it to save them from a 15-year prison sentence, and what they're going to do is to go hunting as planned and to clean their mess up along the way as to not cause any suspicion. They believe that they can just simply tidy her away as if she's nothing more than just their trash, and once they're done, they'll be able to freely continue onwards with their life with nothing to worry about. And that's essentially what they go back and do, with the men burning any evidence of Jennifer ever being there and casually preparing their hunting weapons, as Richard sits back and relaxes to call his wife to tell her just how much he loves her, as if he hasn't just pushed a woman off a cliff to her death. But the thing is, Jen isn't dead. Profusely bleeding and covered in what appears to be fire ants, she jolts awake. Not an entirely unbelievable scenario, as a 47-year-old woman back in 1999 fell 14,500 feet, plummeting to the ground in a skydiving accident, and actually survived long enough to be saved in hospital due to her landing disturbing a nest of fire ants whose venom stimulated her nervous system enough to keep her heart pumping. Awake, impaled upside down, and acutely aware of the pain she's currently in, she uses the cord from her headphones to grab her lighter, which she then uses to start a fire beneath her, which weakens the tree, allowing her to snap the branch off that's still inside of her. Remember kids, save a life, don't buy AirPods. With the tree branch still viciously protruding from her insides, and somehow without an entirely snapped back, she somehow manages to muster up the strength to drag herself against the wall to hide from the men as they've returned to look from above. After seeing her gone and heading down to investigate further, the men discover the blood trail and begin to track her, believing that she obviously won't get far with her insides leaking all over the place. But eventually, the trail comes to an end as the trio reach a river, so they channel their inner Scooby-Doo and split up. But we all know that splitting up in a horror movie can only lead to an excruciating death, just like in Scooby-Doo. Alone, Dimitri stops to take a bathroom break as Jennifer is hidden nearby. She notices his gun left unattended and begins to make her way over to it. She grabs it and points it towards his face, and when she pulls the trigger, it doesn't fire. It's unloaded, so he grabs it from her, knocks her to the ground, and then punches her in the face. He tells the others via the radio that he's got her and that he's going to deal with the situation before dragging Jennifer into the river and attempting to drown her. Before, Dimitri simply chose to just walk away from a horrific situation rather than get himself directly involved. But it appears he's no longer of that same mindset, as he repeatedly forces her head under the water before bringing her back up to taunt her. This isn't just about getting the deed done so the men can move on with their lives. He's enjoying it, savouring it even. But due to him having to go all bad guy and take his sweet time taunting her, it gives Jennifer the opportunity to grab his knife and plunge it into his eye socket, causing him to frantically run around screaming in pain until he collapses into the river dead. After retrieving the knife and his gun, she drives off into the night on his ATV until it eventually runs out of fuel, forcing her to leave it behind as she presses onwards on foot. She makes her way down into a cave, cracks one of Dimitri's beers after a long hard day of falling off cliffs, being impaled and drowned, and decides to take a look at her injury, which is still poking out of her insides by the way, like a non-consensual extra limb or something. Laying down in absolute agony, she notices her locket, the very same locket that she hid the peyote in the other night, and remembering the story by Richard about the guy cutting off his own leg without feeling anything, she decides to take it. Very quickly, the effects begin to take hold of her, as moments ago she was crying out in agony while simply trying to move her shirt around the wound, but is now cutting it out of her body as if she's just playing a casual game of Operation. She pulls it out without so much as a flinch, before quickly cauterizing it with the beer can as the wound is pulsating with blood. The next morning, as Stan is washing himself down with the river water, Dimitri's bloated face suddenly emerges right in front of him, causing Stan to fall into the nice refreshing water and bathe in the decomposing sludge of his friend. After filling his clothes with rocks and throwing him back into the water, much like with Jennifer, Richard has a plan to cover it all up, stating that he told Dimitri that he should never have went hunting on his own, as the desert is a really dangerous place. In the process, absolutely refusing to back down and signal defeat, despite Stan clearly not being cut out for this type of thing and wanting to just call it quits. But Richard never will, disregarding the giant hole he's digging himself into in the process. And after Stan blames Richard for all of this, Richard responds by turning around, breaking his nose, and carrying on with the hunt for Jennifer. He's absolutely ruthless and will not be beaten. We see Jennifer wake up the next morning with the beer can logo singed into her skin as some sort of walking billboard for the company, along with a surprisingly well-healed looking injury on account of being impaled and all of that. She's determined to finish what she started with Dimitri and gets up ready to hunt down the next two men. But as she does, Richard jumps out in front of her, blows her head off with a shotgun, putting an end to the movie. Except he doesn't. And that was just a dream, followed by another dream, oh, and another dream. Yeah, she's still tripping her non-existent balls off. Eventually, she does wake up for good, hesitant about any men jumping out of the walls wielding shotguns, and somehow her injury is as miraculously well healed as it was in the dream. Finding the ATV, the men decide to split up once again, because it clearly worked so well for them the last time, and Jennifer spots Stan all on his own due to a mirror he's using causing a glare. Using her superhuman teleportation skills to close the distance that she just had to use a binocular to see, she's able to quickly catch up to the car as Stan pulls over to refill the fuel tank. After a while, she eventually lines up a shot and takes it, hitting Stan in the shoulder and knocking herself down due to the force. But when she approaches the vehicle, apparently Stan's too gain the ability to teleport, as he's nowhere to be seen. Now the tables have been turned and the hunter has become the hunted. Much like they did to her earlier, she follows the convenient blood trail left behind by Stan as he attempts to run away. He does eventually notice it and decides to take off his shoe so he can use his sock as a makeshift tourniquet, because I guess he just panicked and couldn't think of another spot on his body that just happens to be covered in some kind of fabric. With the trailer to stop, and with his rifle in hand, he then hides amongst the rocks as Jennifer runs right past him, giving him the opportunity to emerge from behind and take a shot despite having this little condition known as shoulder full of bullets. The bullet rips off the lower half of her ear, narrowly avoiding her head, and she quickly makes a run for it as several more shots are fired her way. Ahead of Stan, she smashes her torch against the rock, causing the shoeless man to run full speed into it, sending him flying to the ground in agony. The shard has found itself buried deep into his foot, with none of it protruding from the sole, forcing him to stick his fingers deep into there in an attempt to forcefully remove it. In an absolutely agonizing to watch scene, he repeatedly tries and fails to get it loose by digging around in there, before eventually holding his breath and just going for it. But with no clear end to grab onto, he's rummaging around in the insides of his own feet for an uncomfortably long amount of time until he's eventually able to pull it out. He then hobbles his way back to the car and repeatedly attempts to push the clutch to get the engine going, viciously spraying blood out of the bottom of his foot every time he attempts to do so. But eventually, he does manage to get it going, and he's had enough. He drives full speed towards Jennifer, but she's ready. As he turns the corner, she begins firing shots, until eventually, a second before being turned into a red paste on the side of the road, the shot lands on his head. And after investigating the car to see if the shot actually killed him this time, she finds him very much dead with a hole in the back of his head. Back with Richard, he repeatedly attempts to get in contact with Stan via the radio, but Stan has a rather hard time responding due to the contents of his skull lining the back of his car. Finally accepting this isn't going the way he wants it to, Richard heads back to the house and calls in his helicopter ride. And as he's in the shower, having a nice relaxing wash after a hard 2 days of work of failing miserably at killing an impaled woman hobbling around the desert with her guts leaking all over the place, he suddenly hears a noise. Naked and afraid, he grabs his gun and begins checking the property, and after thinking that it was just the pool cleaning device, he lets his guard down and walks back into the house to find himself confronted by Jennifer. In the exact same way that Jennifer actually found herself confronted by Stan back at the beginning of the movie, before he would then go on to commit an unforgivable heinous act. Except her intentions are different to Stan's. She wants death and fires at him, hitting him in the gut as one of those unbearable infomercials play in the background. With the contents of his small intestines leaking all over the house, he drags himself to the back of the building and very nearly gets the drop on Jennifer until she notices his blood that should be on the inside, actually on the outside and leaking all over the floor, giving away his position in the process, causing her to back up, sealing himself up with cling film to keep his guts inside him as if he's some sort of half-eaten sandwich ready to be saved for later. Jennifer spots him and the chase is on. As he's running around naked, grunting like a maniacal monkey, she slips on the blood, giving Richard the opportunity to knock her unconscious. But much like Dimitri earlier, he can't help himself and has to choke her against the wall to give the typical bad guy speech. And while he goes off on his little misogynistic ego trip about women this and women that, she shoves her hand into his wound and shoots him through the chest with a shotgun. I guess that sandwich isn't getting saved for later. Bloody and beaten, Jennifer is just about able to pull herself to her feet. She walks outside as the helicopter approaches and the movie comes to an end. The resemblance to the 1978 and 2010 remake of I Spit on Your Grave is quite noticeably clear, simply down to the subgenre of horror that it is, with it being an R and revenge flick. And while it does feel remarkably similar to the movie that came out almost 45 years prior, it does have the modern day flashy look of most action thrillers, and it could always just be a simple coincidence, but it does seem to quite literally wear its inspirations on its sleeve, with the main character being named Jennifer in both Revenge and I Spit on Your Grave. However, I think I do prefer how Revenge handles things, with it placing far less of an emphasis on the initial horrific assault that actually kicks things off. I Spit on Your Grave, both original and remake, felt incredibly mean in this regard. Of course, it has the effect of making you just really hate how despicable these characters are and has you rooting for their untimely demise, but it just keeps on going. And when I think back on it in retrospect, it has me thinking, was that really necessary? If you think about it, whether you see it explicitly happen or not see it explicitly happen, unless there's something seriously wrong with you, you know it's one of the most horrific things that someone can do to someone. So it begs the question, why make it so brutal and so in your face? Of course, it's still here, it's still present, and a lot of people aren't going to like it simply because of that. It definitely handles it in a different sort of way and places the emphasis on the movie on what comes next, and in my opinion, that's what these type of movies should really be about: the revenge. Before we finish things up, I'd like to just give a shout out to my clothing brand, Morbid Minds. If you like anything that you see on screen now, make sure you go to morbidminds.co.uk to cop yourself a cool hoodie or t-shirt, and there are new designs coming soon, so stay tuned for that. Also, if you're down in the description clicking links anyway, you may as well follow me on Twitter. And before we come to an end, let me give the final big shout out to my patrons. A thank you to Dom, Hunters263, Rebecca Pitts, A Dandy in Space, Martin Brannan, Natasha Twyman, Jared C. Bees, Pascal Mathis, Fighting the Pirates, Richard McGowan III, Macy J, Reese Harford, Horatio, Raimi Patterson, Chris, Michelle, Newcomb, Dennis, Wade Knott, Ike, Ashley L. Wintz, Austin Wypert, Christopher Butsky, Joshua Torres, Axon Umari, Billy Kyle, Remy, Dimitri, Fire Goes Fast, and Josh Brooks. Thank you so much to my patrons, and thank you to everyone else for watching.